The bell above the diner door chimed with a hollow metallic ring, but the man who stumbled in didn't want a menu. He wanted a miracle. He collapsed into the corner booth, clutching a terrified 5-year-old girl to his side with one hand and leveling a heavy, matte black handgun at Nkemka's chest with the other. Between his fingers, dark arterial blood seeped into the yellowed linoleum, a stark contrast to the pristine, $1,000 silk of his suit. The neon open sign hummed with a low, rhythmic buzz that set Nkemka's teeth on edge. Outside, the city's humidity was a physical weight, the kind of thick, stagnant air that trapped the smell of exhaust and old grease against the pavement. Nkemka Kinechukwu leaned against the counter, her reflection in the glass pie case showing a woman whose eyes were far older than her 26 years. The digital clock above the grill flickered to 3:12 a.m. She had been on her feet for 14 hours, a double shift fueled by lukewarm coffee and the desperate need to make rent before the 3-day notice on her door became a reality. She had once dreamed of being a sociologist, of studying the very people she now served, but the weight of family obligations and a series of quiet tragedies had anchored her to this diner stool. She had learned the hard way that in this neighborhood, survival meant being invisible. She had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of being just the help, a ghost in a stained apron, never imagining that her invisibility was exactly what a dying king would need to stay alive. Nkemka didn't move until the heavy door clicked shut, sealing them inside with the smell of old grease and impending death. The man's gun hand wavered, his knuckles white against the black steel, before his arm finally dropped, the weapon clattering onto the linoleum. He slumped back against the vinyl booth, his face the color of wet ash. The back room, Nkemka commanded, her voice a low, steady anchor in the sudden silence. She didn't wait for him to agree. She scooped up the little girl, Soyun, who was surprisingly light and trembling like a trapped bird. Minjae groaned, a wet, rattling sound, but he used his remaining strength to stagger after her, trailing a crimson path across the floor she had mopped only an hour ago. In the cramped employee break room, Nkemka cleared a table with a single sweep of her arm, sending stacks of napkins and sugar packets flying. "Lay him down," she told the girl, though she was the one doing the heavy lifting, guiding the man's massive, muscular frame onto the hard surface. She worked with a rhythmic, detached precision. Her hands, calloused from years of double shifts, didn't shake as she sliced through his silk shirt with a pair of kitchen shears. The wound was jagged, a puncture just below the ribs. Outside, the world pulsed with a sudden, rhythmic blue. Nkemka froze. Through the grime-streaked window, a police cruiser had pulled into the lot, its headlights cutting through the humidity. The officer didn't get out. He was likely just finishing a report or nursing his own cup of bitter coffee, but his presence turned the room into a tomb. "Don't make a sound," she whispered to the wide-eyed girl. Minjae's eyes flickered open, wild and glazed. He reached for his waistband, but Nkemka pinned his hand down with surprising force. "If you fight me, you bleed out. If you shoot, they come in. Pick one." He subsided, his breath hitching. Nkemka reached into her locker, pulling out a small, unlabeled mason jar filled with a thick, pungent green paste, a mixture of bitter leaf and alligator pepper her grandmother had taught her to grind for the deep hurts. It was a remedy for a world that didn't provide doctors for people like them. She packed the wound with the paste, the scent of herbs momentarily masking the copper tang of blood. Minjae arched off the table, a silent scream caught in his throat, his hand involuntarily crushing Nkemka's shoulder. She didn't flinch. She grabbed a clean bar towel, cinched it tight with duct tape from the maintenance closet, and leaned her full weight onto the puncture. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Outside, the cruiser's engine turned over, the blue lights fading as the car rolled back onto the street. Only then did Nkemka exhale. She looked down at her hands, stained dark and smelling of ancient earth, then at the man who was now watching her with a terrifying, focused intensity. He wasn't just a patient anymore. He was a catalyst, and the quiet life she had built was already burning down. The transition from the diner to Nkemka's fourth-floor walk-up was a blur of adrenaline and muffled pain. She led them through the narrow, salt-stained service alley, avoiding the main street where the police cruiser had finally drifted away. Min-jae moved like a ghost of a man, his weight leaning heavily into Nkimka's shoulder, while Seo-yoon clung to the hem of Nkimka's apron, her tiny footsteps silent on the damp pavement. When the door to her apartment finally clicked shut, the silence of the hallway was replaced by the hum of a refrigerator and the ticking of a cheap plastic clock. Nkimka's home was a single room that smelled of lavender and old floorboards, a space so small it felt like a jewel box or a cage, depending on the day. Min-jae surveyed the room with a pained, squinting gaze. He took in the faded thrift store armchair, the stack of sociology textbooks used as a nightstand, and the single window overlooking a brick wall. To a man who likely woke up in silk sheets surrounded by marble, this was a broom closet. He lowered himself onto her narrow bed, his bespoke suit jacket ruined, the fine fabric dragging against her simple cotton duvet. "It's clean," Nkimka said, her voice sharp as she caught his judgmental glance. "And more importantly, it isn't registered to anyone with a name your enemies would know." She moved to the small kitchenette, pulling a hidden floorboard loose to reveal an emergency stash of cash and more of her grandmother's supplies. Min-jae watched her, his hand still hovering near the heavy handgun he had tucked into his waistband. "You live like this," he rasped, his voice a low vibration of disbelief and fever. "Working those hours for this?" "I live in peace," Nkimka countered, stepping back toward him with a basin of warm water. "Something you clearly couldn't buy with all those blood-stained hundreds." The friction between them was a physical heat. He was a creature of command, used to the world bending to his will, and here he was, vulnerable in a space where he held no power. When she reached out to check his bandage, he flinched, his fingers clamping around her wrist with bruising force. Nkimka didn't pull away. She looked him directly in the eyes, her gaze as steady as a mountain. "In this room, I'm the one who knows how to keep you alive," she whispered. "Let go of me, or go back to the diner and see who finds you first." Slowly, his grip loosened. His hand dropped, but he didn't look away. In the corner, Seo-yoon had curled into Nkimka's armchair, her eyes finally fluttering shut as the safety of the small room took hold. Min-jae looked at his daughter, then back at the waitress in the stained uniform. For the first time, the predatory edge in his expression softened into something resembling a wary, profound respect. He was a king in exile, and he had just realized he was being protected by a woman who feared nothing he had to offer. By the second evening, the apartment felt smaller, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and the heavy, unspoken weight of Min-jae's presence. He sat in the shadows of the corner, a wounded lion watching his cub. But Seo-yoon was fading. The little girl hadn't eaten since they arrived, her small face turning a translucent, ghostly pale. She sat on the edge of the thrift store armchair, her tiny hands folded in her lap, staring at a bowl of warm jollof rice Nkimka had prepared as if it were a foreign object. "She needs to eat," Nkimka said, her voice low but firm. Min-jae didn't look up from the handgun he was meticulously cleaning with a rag. "She doesn't speak to strangers. She doesn't speak much at all since her mother." He let the sentence hang, unfinished and jagged. Nkimka ignored his dismissal. She pulled a small wooden stool over, sitting at Seo-yoon's eye level. The girl flinched, her dark eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears. "Did you know?" Nkimka began softly, not reaching for the girl but looking instead at the steam rising from the bowl, "that when I was your age, I lived in a house that felt very big and very loud? My grandmother used to say I was a silent shadow because I was so scared the world would hear me and decide it didn't like what it heard." Seo-yoon's gaze flickered toward Nkimka's face. In the corner, the clicking of the gun part stopped. "I lost someone too," Nkimka continued, her voice steady despite the old ache in her chest. "After they went away, I thought if I didn't eat and didn't talk, I could make time stop. I thought I could wait for them forever. But my grandmother sat me down, just like this, and told me that every bite of food was a brick. If I didn't eat, I couldn't build a wall to keep the monsters out. And if I didn't talk, I couldn't tell the monsters to go away." Nkimka picked up the spoon, blowing on the rice. This rice is a special recipe. It's got a little bit of magic in the spice. It helps your heart feel heavy enough to stay in your chest, but light enough to keep beating. Slowly, with an agonizing hesitancy, Seo-yun reached out. Her small fingers brushed in Kimka's hand, a touch so light it was barely there, and she took the spoon. She took a tiny, trembling bite. Then another. And Kimka didn't smile. She simply stayed there, a grounded, protective force. When she finally looked up, she found Min-jae staring at her. The lethal, cold calculation in his eyes had been replaced by a raw, startled vulnerability. He looked at Nkimka not as a waitress or a convenient hiding spot, but as a woman who held a power he couldn't grasp with his hands. In that cramped, dim room, the bloodstained lines between them began to blur, replaced by a fragile, newfound gravity. The following morning, Nkimka returned to the diner. Her body ached with a fatigue that went deeper than bone, but she couldn't risk breaking her routine. To disappear now was to leave a trail of breadcrumbs straight to her front door. She moved through the lunch rush like a machine, pouring coffee and clearing plates, her eyes constantly scanning the street through the grease-filmed windows. The shift was nearly over when the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't a loud noise, but a sudden, heavy silence that rippled through the booths. Two men stepped through the door. They didn't belong in this neighborhood. Their suits were tailored with a sharp, aggressive precision that screamed of money and the violence required to keep it. They didn't sit down. They walked straight to the counter, ignoring the wait to be seated sign. "We're looking for a girl," the taller one said. His voice was smooth, devoid of the gravelly desperation of her usual customers. "Worked the late shift Tuesday." Tall, quiet. Handled a messy situation. Kimka didn't look up from the silverware she was rolling. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her hands remained steady. "Lots of girls work here." Tuesday was a double. Could have been anyone. The man leaned over the counter, his presence an oily stain on her sanctuary. He placed a photo on the laminate surface. It wasn't a picture of her, but a grainy screen grab from a traffic camera blocks away, showing her battered sedan turning a corner at 3:30 a.m. "She has a habit of being helpful," the man murmured, his eyes tracking Kimka's every micro-expression. "The kind of help that carries a very high price." Behind him, the second man was already moving toward the employee schedule pinned near the kitchen. Kimka's manager, a man whose spine usually turned to jelly at the sight of a badge or a gun, started to stutter an excuse. "I don't know anything about a price," Kimka said, finally meeting the man's gaze. She used her waitress face, the one that was polite, vacant, and utterly unmemorable. "But I know the health inspector is due in 10 minutes, and he doesn't like people loitering at the prep station. You want to order something, or are you just wasting my light?" The man stared at her for a long beat, a predatory flicker of doubt crossing his face. He didn't know for sure, but he was smelling the scent of her fear. He tapped the photo twice, then slid a heavy, gold-embossed card across the counter. "If she shows up, tell her that some debts can't be paid in tips. They're paid in blood." As they walked out, Kimka didn't breathe until the chime of the door faded. She looked at the card. It bore no name, only a stylized tiger, the mark of the Gyeong Syndicate. The sanctuary had been breached. The invisible woman had been seen, and the clock on their survival had just begun to tick much faster. The apartment felt like a pressure cooker after the encounter at the diner. Kimka didn't tell Min-jae about the men in the suits immediately. Instead, she focused on the ritual of survival. She gathered the basin of warm water and the fresh bandages, her movements deliberate and grounding. Min-jae sat on the edge of the bed, his shirt discarded, revealing a torso that was a living map of ink and scar tissue. As she peeled back the blood-stiffened dressing, the light from her single-floor lamp caught the intricate designs sprawling across his back and shoulders. They weren't just decorative. They were heavy, dense with meaning. "This one," Nkimka murmured, her fingers hovering near a hauntingly detailed weeping willow on his shoulder blade. "It's different from the others." Min-jae flinched, not from pain, but from the intimacy of the question. He remained silent for a long beat, his gaze fixed on Seyun, who was coloring quietly on the floor. "The willow is for my brother," he finally rasped. "He wanted to be an architect. He died so I could become a king. The crane on my ribs is for my father. The lotus on my wrist is for a wife who was a ghost long before she disappeared." And Kimka dipped a cloth into the water, her touch surprisingly tender as she wiped away the dried blood. "Every time you lose someone, you add to the map," she observed. Min-jae looked at his hands that had built an empire on bone and shadow. "In my world, tattoos are supposed to be armor. They're meant to make you look like a monster so no one dares to touch you. But for me, they're just tombstones. I'm carrying a cemetery on my skin." And Kimka. He turned his head, his dark eyes searching hers. The terrifying Mafia boss was gone, replaced by a man who looked exhausted by the weight of his own crown. "I didn't choose the twins over the syndicate because of duty," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I chose them because I'm tired of the ink. I don't want Seo Yun to ever have a reason to put a mark like this on her skin." And Kimka paused, the damp cloth resting against his skin. She saw it then, the shared DNA of their desperation. He wanted to be a father. She wanted to be a person. Both were trapped by systems that viewed them as tools rather than human beings. "The monsters don't stop chasing you just because you're tired," she said softly, thinking of the men at the diner and the tiger embossed card in her pocket. "I know," Min-jae replied, his hand tentatively covering hers against his chest. His heart beat strong and steady beneath the ink. "But for the first time, I have something worth running toward, not just something to run from." In that moment, the waitress and the mobster were gone. There were only two people in a small room, bound by the realization that they were both fighting for a life they hadn't yet been allowed to live. And Kimka didn't reach for a phone. In her neighborhood, digital signals were just breadcrumbs for people with high-tech scanners. Instead, she waited until the sun began to dip below the jagged skyline, casting long, bruised shadows over the tenement buildings. She stepped out onto the fire escape, the rusted metal groaning under her feet, and looked down at the street she had walked every day for a decade. To the wealthy men in the tailored suits, this block was a slum, a blur of broken concrete and disposable people. To Kimka, it was a living, breathing machine of survival. She made her way downstairs, stopping first at the corner fruit stand where Mr. Henderson sat on a milk crate. He was nearly blind, but he could identify the make and model of a car by the rhythm of its engine. "Mr. Henderson," she murmured, leaning over a crate of bruised apples. "There are some men looking for a girl who doesn't want to be found. They drive cars that sound like quiet silk and smell like expensive cologne." The old man didn't look up, but his fingers stilled on a Granny Smith. "I'll keep the rhythm, and Kimka. 2 honks if they're cruising, 3 if they're stopping." She moved through the veins of the neighborhood with a quiet, purposeful grace. She spoke to the teenage boys playing dice near the hydrant, the ones the world called a nuisance, but who saw every face that entered the zip code. She whispered to Mrs. Gable, who sat behind her lace curtains on the 2nd floor, a woman whose boredom had made her the most effective surveillance system in the city. By the time she reached the bodega at the end of the block, the invisible network was humming. It was a human alarm system built on 1,000 small favors, extra shifts she'd covered, groceries she'd shared, and the quiet dignity she had always afforded them. Inside the apartment, Min-jae stood by the window, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife Kimka had sharpened for him. He looked at her as she locked the triple deadbolts, his expression a mix of confusion and awe. "You think they can stop hitmen?" he asked, his voice low. "These people have no guns, no training. They have eyes," Kimka replied, her voice as steady as the brick walls surrounding them. "And they have a reason to hate the people who think they don't exist. Your men look for cameras and heat signatures. My people look for things that don't belong. You spent millions on security that betrayed you, Min-jae. Try trusting the people who have nothing left to lose but each other." As the first 3-tone whistle drifted up from the street, the signal from the dice players that a black SUV had just turned the corner, Min-jae finally stepped away from the glass. For the first time, he realized that Nkemko wasn't just hiding him in a room. She was hiding him inside a fortress made of people he had spent his whole life looking past. The silence following the third whistle was the most violent sound Kimka had ever heard. It wasn't the crash of a door or the bang of a gun, but the absence of Seo-yoon's humming from the small bathroom where she had been washing her face. When Kimka pushed the door open, the window was yawning wide, the rusted security bars sawed through with professional silence. The only thing left behind was a small, colorful crayon, snapped in half on the damp tile. Min-jae let out a sound that wasn't human, a low, guttural roar of a wounded predator. He lunged for the window, his stitches straining against his ruined shirt, but Nkemka grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his muscle with a strength that shocked him. "If you go out that way, you're just a target in a suit," she hissed, her voice vibrating with a cold, terrifying clarity. "Ji-hoon isn't just looking to kill you anymore. He's looking to break you. If you run into the street, you're playing his game." Min-jae turned on her, his eyes wild, the matte black handgun trembling in his grip. "He has my daughter. My blood. I will burn this entire city to find her. Then start the fire where he isn't looking," Nkemka countered. She stepped into the center of the room, and in that moment, the waitress, the woman who smiled for tips and apologized for cold coffee, vanished. Her posture straightened, her jaw set like granite, and her eyes went flat and lethal. She reached into her locker and pulled out a heavy, iron-weighted pipe she kept for protection, along with a burner phone she had kept tucked away for years. "Ji-hoon's men are watching the main roads and the high-end hotels," she said, her words coming out like rapid-fire commands. "They think like soldiers. They expect you to act like a boss. But this is my neighborhood. To them, we are just shadows, and shadows can move through walls." She began to pace, her mind working through the geography of the slums like a grandmaster. He'll take her to the old bottling plant on 4th. It's the only place with enough cover for his SUVs and a private exit to the harbor. He thinks he's safe because he has the high ground. She looked at Min-jae, her gaze pinning him to the spot. "You're going to give him what he wants. You're going to call that number on the Tiger card and tell him you're coming in alone to the front gate. You'll be the distraction. You'll be the dying king surrendering his crown." "And you?" Min-jae asked, his voice a ragged whisper. "I'm the girl no one notices," Nkemka replied, her voice dropping to a predatory chill. "I'm taking the basement tunnels. While he's busy gloating over you, I'm coming for the girl. And Min-jae? If any of them touch her, make sure they don't live long enough to regret it." Would you like me to continue with Chapter 8, where they execute the ghost walk through the city's tunnels? The transition from the tenement to the industrial heart of the city was a descent into a world that existed beneath the notice of the powerful. Nkemka didn't take the streets, she took the veins. She led Min-jae through a rusted basement grate into a network of service corridors and steam tunnels that smelled of damp earth and century-old brick. These were the passages used by the maintenance crews, the homeless, and the forgotten, a geography of the shadows that no GPS could map. Min-jae followed her in a stunned, rhythmic silence. Every time he moved to check a corner with his weapon, Nkemka would simply place a hand on his arm and point to a subtle sign, a chalk mark on a pipe, a discarded cigarette brand, or the way the rats scurried. She wasn't guessing, she was reading the city's pulse. To the syndicate, these tunnels were a sewer. To Nkemka, they were a bypass. "Ji-hoon thinks he owns the sky because he's on the 50th floor," she whispered, her voice echoing softly against the dripping limestone. "But the taller the building, the deeper the roots. Every penthouse is connected to a boiler room." They reached the base of the bottling plant's private elevator shaft. While the main gates were swarming with Ji-hoon's soldiers, expecting Min-jae to arrive in a hail of desperate gunfire, the basement was a tomb. Nkemka used a heavy set of master keys she'd borrowed years ago from a diner regular to bypass the electronic locks. She didn't use the elevator. She led him up the pressurized fire stairs, a climb that tested Min-jae's healing side and Nkemka's iron will. They moved like ghosts, bypassing security cameras by timing their movements to the rhythmic sweep of the lenses, knowledge Nkemka had gleaned from the building's janitors over late-night coffee. They didn't fire a single shot. They didn't even breathe loudly. When they reached the final service door to the executive suite, The sound of Ji-hoon's voice drifted through the gap, arrogant, cold, and dangerously close to So-yoon's soft whimpering. Min-jae's hand went to the door handle, his knuckles white, but he looked at Nkimka first. The hierarchy had completely inverted. The man who ruled through fear was looking for the signal from the woman who ruled through observation. Nkimka gave a single, sharp nod. The ghost walk was over. The waitress who had spent her life being overlooked was about to walk into a room of monsters and show them exactly what happens when you underestimate the person who serves your coffee. They burst through the door not as a mobster and a victim, but as a unified storm, catching the traitor in the middle of his triumph before he could even register that the shadows had come for him. The penthouse was a wreckage of broken glass and shattered egos. Ji-hoon lay silent, stripped of his stolen authority, while So-yoon clung to Nkimka's neck as if she were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. Min-jae stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the sunrise bleeding a violent orange over the city he had nearly lost. He looked at his hands, the ink of the willow and the crane dark against his pale skin, and then he looked at the waitress in the torn apron. "It is done," he said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "The council has seen the coup fail. My seat is reclaimed. Ji-hoon's blood will pay for the terror he brought into your home." He stepped toward Nkimka, his movements regaining their feline grace despite the bandages beneath his suit. He reached out, his fingers hovering near the bruise on her cheek. "You saved my daughter. You saved my life. I have estates in Jeju, penthouses in Seoul, and more wealth than this city can count. You will never have to pour another cup of coffee. You will never have to be invisible again. Ask for anything, Nkimka. It is yours." Nkimka gently pried So-yoon's small hands from her shoulder and set the girl down, though she kept her hand resting protectively on the child's head. She looked out at the city, her city, where the street vendors were just beginning to set up their stalls and the night shift workers were walking home in the gray light. "I don't want a penthouse, Min-jae," she said, her voice steady and echoing with a new, quiet authority. "And I don't want to be a trophy on your shelf. I've spent my life being small so I wouldn't be broken. I'm done with that." She met his gaze, refusing to blink. "The Gyeong Syndicate runs on fear. That's why your men betrayed you. Because fear is a currency that loses value the moment someone is more afraid of the enemy than they are of you. You want me to stay? We change the business. No more protection rackets that bleed neighborhoods dry. We provide actual protection. We invest in the blocks that hide us. We become the foundation, not the parasite." Min-jae stared at her, the shock on his face slowly giving way to a profound, transformative realization. He saw not just a savior, but a partner, a woman whose ordinary courage was more powerful than his arsenal. "A partnership of equals," he murmured, the words sounding like a vow. "Exactly," Nkimka replied. She reached out and took his hand, the same hand that had held a gun to her chest in a dark diner only days before. "We modernize. We survive. Together." Outside, the city began to wake. Somewhere, a bell chimed above a diner door. Somewhere, a delivery driver navigated the morning rush. But in that high, quiet room, a new reign had begun, one built not on ink and blood, but on the quiet, unbreakable power of a woman who refused to stay invisible any longer. Nkimka didn't need his luxury. She had already found something better. She had found her voice, and she had delivered a future.